Everything you think you know about reading people is likely wrong. In fact, the popular hacks you've been taught, that crossing arms means defensiveness, or looking up and left means someone is constructing a lie, it's not just inaccurate, they're actively making you socially blind. We are living in an era where a lot of people fancy themselves a bit of a human lie detector, armed with a handful of generic tricks they've picked up from a 10-second video. But here is the dangerous truth. If you're analysing a gesture without analysing the person first, you aren't reading body language, you're just guessing. I want to address something here straight away. Recently in my short form content, I've been breaking down specific nonverbal cues, things like the suprasternal notch cover, the thumb display and pacifying behaviours we use when we're stressed. And despite the note or disclaimer that I've put in the description about establishing baseline and context and other examples of when that behaviour is pretty normal, my comment section has been quite lively. Some comments I won't even repeat. There's a few of you been pushing back and seems some of you are a little bit angry. But, is what it is. My video about touching the neck as a self-soothing mechanism, someone commented, maybe their neck's just itchy. And on the video about hiding thumbs, indicating low confidence, another person said, maybe his hands are just cold. And perhaps one of the most common criticisms across the board I see is the accusation that analysing body language is nothing more than pseudoscience. Here's the thing. You're absolutely right. If you take those videos in a vacuum, ignoring the disclaimer, if you isolate a simple gesture and strip off its environment, you're correct. An itchy neck is just an itchy neck. Cold hands are just cold hands. And trying to determine a person's entire physiological state from a single movement is pseudoscience. It's astrology for behaviourists. The reason I'm making this long form video and the reason I'm going to ask you to reference this whenever you watch my shorter clips is because of the three words that are often missing from the pop psychology conversation: baseline, context, and deviation. Without establishing a baseline, every observation you make is a hallucination. So today I'm going to dismantle the myths of universal body language. We're going to replace genetic tricks with a bit of a psychological framework. I'm going to dissect why the accusation of pseudoscience is valid only when you ignore the scientific method of observation. We're going to stop looking at what people do and start looking at when and why they shift. This is the difference between judging someone and actually understanding them. Let's start by burning the rulebook. There is a persistent belief in our culture that there is a universal dictionary of body language, a Rosetta Stone where gesture A always equates to meaning B. This is what I call the universal cue fallacy. It's the idea that all humans, regardless of culture, upbringing, neurotype or environment, use the exact same physical code to express their internal state. Statistically and biologically, this is nonsense. Let's look at a classic example, the crossed arms. If you read a body language book from 1985, or perhaps you listen to a sales trainer who's come to educate you on how to sell to people and they want to throw a bit of non-verbal in there, they're going to tell you that a person crossing their arms is closed off, defensive, or rejecting your ideas. But let's apply a physiological lens to this. Why do humans cross their arms? Yes, sometimes it is a blocking mechanism. We protect our ventral side, where our vital organs are located, when we feel threatened. But we also cross our arms to conserve body heat. We cross our arms to relieve tension in the shoulders after a long day of typing. We cross our arms simply because it's a comfortable, low energy posture that allows us to listen more purely without the distraction of our hands. If you walk into a room and see someone with crossed arms and you immediately assume they are hostile, you're falling victim to confirmation bias. This is the psychological mechanism where your brain seeks out evidence to support what you already believe and ignores any evidence that contradicts it. Once you label that person as defensive because of their arms, your brain will interpret their silence as sulking rather than listening. It will interpret their questions as attacks rather than curiosity. You're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of conflict, all because you misread a thermal regulation tactic as an emotional one. And this becomes even more dangerous in the modern landscape of neurodiversity. We have to talk about how we read people with ADHD, autism, or higher social anxiety. The traditional lie detection model penalises these individuals unfairly. Standard deception cues often include failing to make eye contact, fidgeting, leg bouncing, or stuttering. However, for a neurodivergent individual, avoiding eye contact might be necessary to process auditory information. If they look at your eyes, their brain is flooded with social data and they physically cannot hear your words. So they look away to listen better. That leg bounce, it's not nervous guilt. This is a regulation stim. It's a way to burn off excess dopamine or cortisol to remain focused. If you apply the universal cue fallacy to a neurodivergent person, you will view their attempts to pay attention as attempts to deceive you. This isn't just awkward, it's a failure of empathy. It destroys trust before it can even be built. So, if we can't trust universal signs, what can we trust? We trust the baseline. In scientific research, you never run an experiment without a control group, a standard against which you measure change. In social interaction, the individual baseline is that control group. A baseline is the unique set of normal behaviours, tics, vocal tones, and posture habits a person exhibits when they are under zero pressure and in a neutral context. You cannot spot a lie and you cannot spot hidden anger unless you know what that person looks like when they are telling the truth and when they are happy. So how do we capture this? You need to become an observer before you become a participant. When you first meet someone, or within the first few minutes of a conversation, you are in the data collection phase. You're not analysing, you are cataloguing. First, you need to establish the vocal baseline. Listen to the rhythm of their speech. Do they talk fast, tripping over words, or are they slow and methodical? What is their pitch? Some people naturally speak with a lot of ums and ahs. That is their baseline cognitive processing style. If you don't note that now, you'll think they are stalling for time later. Listen to the volume. Are they naturally boisterous? Or are they quiet? If a loud person suddenly becomes quiet, that matters. And if a quiet person suddenly gets loud, that matters. But you only know that if you know where they started. Second, look at the ocular baseline. What's their natural blink rate? The average human blinks around 15 to 20 times per minute, but that's an average and not a rule. Some people have a dry eye condition or wear contact lenses and blink 40 times a minute. If you don't establish that 40 blinks is normal for them, you will see it as a stress response later. Also, look at their eye contact duration. Do they naturally hold your gaze or do they dart around the room? We often hear that liars look away. Actually, research suggests that practiced liars hold eye contact too long because they are trying to convince you. They're looking to see whether you're believing their lie. But again, This also depends on the individual. An introvert might naturally look at the floor. And third, the postural baseline. How do they sit? Do they take up space or do they condense themselves? Once years ago in one of my companies, I interviewed a man who sat hunched over, hands between his knees, looking at the floor. It looked like the posture of someone defeated or perhaps guilty. But it turned out that was just how he sat. He was perfectly happy. Yeah, he had bad posture and a bit of a shy disposition, but that was his baseline. If I'd have judged him by the textbook, I would have completely misread his confidence level. This requires a shift in how you engage. When you ask, "How was your weekend?" or "Did you find the office okay?" you shouldn't just be listening to the answer. You should be watching how they answer. Watch them when the stakes are low. Watch them when they talk about something they love. Watch them when they are bored. You are building a mental model of patient zero. You are calibrating your instrument. Only once you have this baseline established can you even begin to look for the truth. So now we get to the core of the methodology. The secret to reading human behaviour is not found in the movement itself. It's found in the shift. We are looking for the moment the baseline breaks. We're looking for that deviation. Human beings are creatures of homeostasis. We like to stay in our baseline. We crave equilibrium. When we experience a threat, whether it's a physical threat, a threat to our ego, or the cognitive threat of having to construct a lie, our limbic system kicks in. This is the ancient part of the brain responsible for survival, specifically the amygdala and the hypothalamus. It triggers the 3 Fs: freeze, flight, or fight. But in a modern social setting, these don't look like running away into the forest or punching someone in the face. They manifest as micro shifts. Let's go back to our itchy nose comment. If a person touches their nose throughout the entire conversation, while talking about the weather, their kids, and their job, then touching their nose means nothing. It's a baseline habit. However, imagine a person who has sat perfectly still with their hands on the table for 20 minutes. Their baseline is stillness. Suddenly you ask them, "Why is there a gap in the accounting logs for March?" At that exact moment, they reach up and scratch their nose. That is a shift. The gesture itself, the scratch, is kind of irrelevant. The timing of the gesture relative to the stimulus, the question, and the deviation from the norm is everything. Consider the honest fidgeter case study. And this is where most people get it wrong. Imagine you are talking to a colleague named Steve. Steve is high energy. He taps his foot, he plays with his pen, and he looks around. So his baseline is high kinetic energy. Now you ask Steve a hard question. "Steve, did you know about the layoffs before the meeting?" If Steve is lying, or if he is terrified, his limbic system might trigger a freeze response to avoid detection, a predatory defense mechanism hardwired into our biology. Suddenly, Steve stops tapping his foot. He puts the pen down and he goes a bit rigid. To the untrained eye, Steve maybe looks calm, but to the expert eye, Steve just screamed. His baseline was movement. His response to the stressor was a total freeze of movement. The silence of his body is the alarm bell. If you were studying Steve by the universal laws, you think his fidgeting was bad and his stillness was good. But by using the baseline, you see the reality. The fidgeting was his comfort zone. The stillness is his fear. You must become obsessed with the break in the rhythm. And that brings us to the most dangerous trap of all. The trap that puts innocent people in jail and can ruin relationships. And it's called the Othello error. And it's named after Shakespeare's character who killed his wife because he mistook her fear of being killed for the fear of being caught. Here is the physiological reality that separates pop psychology from actual behavioural science. The body does not know the difference between the stress of lying and the stress of being accused. If I accuse you of stealing my watch and you didn't do it, your heart rate will still spike. You will still sweat. Your voice might still crack. You're experiencing situational stress. If you did steal my watch, can I have it back? You will experience those exact same symptoms. So, how do we tell the difference? How do we differentiate between a liar and an anxious person? We have to look at cognitive load. So, lying is intellectually expensive. It burns glucose, literally. To tell a lie, you have to suppress the truth, construct a fabrication, ensure the fabrication fits the known facts, monitor the listener to see if they believe you, and control your own body language. That's a massive amount of brain power. Anxiety is emotional, but it isn't necessarily complex in the same way. When someone is under the heavy cognitive load of lying, you will often see a degradation in their verbal complexity. If they didn't do it before, they might start repeating your question to buy time. They might use simpler grammar. They might stop using contractions, saying, I did not instead of I didn't, because they are trying to be empathic. Situational stress or anxiety usually makes people talk more. They ramble, they over-explain, they give unnecessary details. They stumble over their words, but the volume of information increases. Deception stress often makes people talk less, become rigid, and carefully curate their words. We also have to filter for the modern environment. If you're doing a job interview over Zooms or Teams, or perhaps confronting your partner over FaceTime, there's a delay. There is the stress of looking at yourself in the camera as well. If you see someone look away from the camera, they aren't necessarily breaking eye contact due to deception. They might just be looking at your face on their screen, which is usually located below the camera lens. This is the context filter. Before you assign a meaning to a behaviour, you must ask, is there an environmental reason for this shift? Did the air conditioning just turn on? Then they likely cross their arms because they are cold. Did a waiter just drop a tray? They likely blinked rapidly because of the acoustic startle reflex. Is the chair uncomfortable? Then they are shifting weight to relieve pain, not because they are squirming with guilt. If you skip the context filter, you're just projecting your own suspicions onto their discomfort. So how do we put this all together? How do you actually use this in your daily life, whether it's with your partner, your boss, or a new date, without turning into a paranoid interrogator? I want to give you a 3-step precision framework. This is the bridge between theory and practice, right? Step 1 is the calibration phase. This is where you ask the softball questions. If you've ever seen a police interview online, perhaps on YouTube, this is the how are you doing, how are you feeling, how's your family, how'd you get here, and everything else. You ask all these before you get into the heavy stuff. You must ask about things that have zero emotional weight. Ask about the weather, the commute, the lunch menu, but do it with intent. And your intent there is to watch the body, watch the blink rate, listen to the pitch, lock in that baseline. Don't skip this step. If you jump straight into the conflict without calibration, you've got no map. So then step 2 is the probing phase. This is where you introduce the stimulus. You ask the question you actually care about. How do you feel about the new project timeline? Or, where were you last night? Now, Do not listen for the words immediately. Watch for the shift. Did the foot stop tapping? Did the blink rate spike? Did they suddenly cover their suprasternal notch? Note the deviation. But this is not a conclusion, it's just a data point. Step 3 is the verification phase, and this is where most people either don't get to or they fail. If you see a shift, do not accuse. I mean it, do not accuse. A shift is not a confession, it's just a hotspot. It indicates that something about that topic caused a physiological reaction. It could be a lie, yeah, but it could also be embarrassment. It could be that the question reminded them of something else entirely. Your job now is to explore the hotspot with empathy and not aggression. Instead of saying, I know you're lying because you touched your neck, which is confrontational and likely incorrect, you use the observation to pivot. You say, you seemed a little hesitant about the timeline. Is there something worrying you about it? Or, I noticed you got quiet when I mentioned the budget. Is there something on your mind? Give them the space to explain the stress. If they relax and return to baseline, it was likely situational stress or perhaps a misunderstanding. Now, if they escalate, become rigid, or the deviations get more intense, you've likely found a deception cluster. This method transforms you from a judge into a curious observer. And as I mentioned, it's a cluster. It's not about one singular behaviour. We look at shifts in several different behaviours together to form a cluster. All these individual data points coming together to build a picture. We started this discussion talking about negative comments, itchy necks, and the accusation of pseudoscience. And I hope now you see why context is the only thing that matters. The goal of learning body language is not to become a human polygraph machine. It's not to catch your friend in a lie or to dominate a negotiation. The goal is empathy. When you understand baselines, you stop misjudging the people around you. You stop thinking your introverted partner is bored just because they are quiet. You stop thinking your anxious employee is shifty just because they fidget. You start seeing people for who they actually are, not who you expect them to be. When you notice a shift, when you see the deviation from the baseline, it's an invitation. It's a signal that the person in front of you is feeling something intense. It's your cue to lean in, to get curious, and to connect. So the next time you watch one of my shorts and you see me point out a specific cue, remember this conversation. Remember the baseline, and remember that the truth isn't in the gesture, it's in the change. This is where the science lives, and this is where the truth is found.